Hey everyone, welcome into the Week 15 edition of the Fantasy Football Rankings versus Consensus. My name is Bradley Stalder. You can follow me on Twitter at FFStalder. And today I will be going through one player I'm higher on and one player I'm lower on per position versus the expert consensus. You can think of it as a love-hate, or you can think of it however you'd like. But that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to go through, 8 players that I have stronger opinions on than the consensus. So let's get into it. But before we do, I want to talk about the contest that I've been competing in this year. Every year, Fantasy Pros hosts a fantasy football rankings accuracy contest with over 200 of the industry's top writers and experts. The scoring is fierce. It requires experts to perfectly predict the order in which quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends will rank at the end of every NFL week. I also rank DSTs and kickers and IDP players. So check out the bottom of the article I have up on fantasy data for my most up-to-date rankings and notes on Fantasy Pros. And look, we got news today about Mike White. Mike White was originally on this list, but I had to make a quick pivot. So make sure you're checking out those rankings. I will be updating them throughout the week, and I anticipate a lot of news will come out that does cause changes to these rankings between now and, well, the final submission, which is Sunday at 1 p.m. I also want to take a minute to remind you that there are 3 Saturday games. So I would recommend setting up your lineups kind of like how they are Thursday games, where you want to move those players out of the flex if at all possible, or minimize the amount of Saturday flex plays if you were planning on starting them anyways, just for flexibility's sake, as we continue to get news and we get clarity on player injuries or surprise inactives. So last week was not a great week. I didn't get enough time to dive as deep as I wanted to into the rankings, and I missed on a couple players. So I finished 125th out of over 200 rankers. It was my worst finish. Still, like 40th percentile is like middle of the road there. It was bad by my standards, but it wasn't terrible. I finished 17th at kicker, 13th at IDP, and I'm 50th overall in accuracy of quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. And that's out of 211 rankers year to date. And this is also a reminder that I advise Fantasy Data's weekly rankings. They're an excellent resource for anyone looking to win their league, along with player projections and advanced metrics. So I encourage you, follow me on this journey as I highlight a few players that I want to be higher or lower on than consensus for week 15. But before we do, shameless plug. If you haven't gotten a Fantasy Data subscription, now is the time. Or buy it for someone else. Give them the gift of Fantasy Data. Use the promo code FFF20, and that'll get you 20% off any Fantasy Data subscription, any size, $5, $500, anywhere in between. Get your Fantasy Data subscription today. Perfect gift for the holidays. Use that promo code FFF20, 20% off any Fantasy Data subscription. I use it in the industry. JJ Zacharyson uses it. Matthew Berry uses it. Fantasy footballers use it. The best in the industry use Fantasy Data, not just for the NFL, but also for PGA, MLB, NBA, and NCAA. So now you'll be able to use it for lineup optimization, getting the stats that you need, and helping you make the best decisions for your fantasy lineups, especially as we're into fantasy playoffs right now. Originally, this was going to be Mike White, and I was very, very bullish on Mike White, but I had to pivot with the news that Mike White was ruled out due to not receiving clearance from the doctors for his ribs injury. So Matt Ryan becomes my higher ranked quarterback for this week. Ryan, yes, he's struggled over the last 3 games. He's finished as the quarterback 22 or worse every week during that 3-game span. It was Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and the Dallas defenses. And those are no joke. Like, Baltimore wasn't able to get going much against them, against Pittsburgh. Philadelphia is one of the toughest. And of course, Dallas is one of the toughest. It's just a really rough stretch for Matt Ryan. But there is hope on the horizon. Matt Ryan and the Indianapolis Colts get the Minnesota Vikings this week in what projects to put Ryan on this streaming radar. And Matt Ryan has hit ceiling games against bad defenses this year. We've seen it happen. He's finished as the quarterback 2 overall against Jacksonville and the quarterback 5 against Las Vegas. The Vikings allow the most passing yards, 6th most fantasy points, and are the 6th best pass DVOA matchup to the quarterback position. They just allowed Detroit Lions quarterback Jared Goff to throw for 3 touchdowns, 330 yards. Matt Ryan ranks as my quarterback 12 this week. His consensus quarterback 21. My lower ranked quarterback for this week is Patrick Mahomes. And there are only, I think, 2 fantasy rankers right now who are lower on Patrick Mahomes than I am. So Patrick Mahomes, he's faced some tough secondaries as of late. The Rams, Bengals, and Broncos have all limited Mahomes to no better than a top 6 quarterback finish. In fact, what might be lost in the road win against Denver was that Mahomes threw 3 interceptions, and now he gets a Houston Texans secondary that, yes, it may be poor in metrics, but the Texans give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and that's because the Houston Texans run defense gives up the most fantasy points to running backs. Okay. This projects as an Isaiah Pacheco game. However, Mahomes, he's still startable. You're not benching Mahomes. That's silly. But we need to just temper a little bit of expectations because this game could get out of hand on the ground. Mahomes is my quarterback 5. He's the consensus 2, and I'm one of the lowest among all the Fantasy Pros rankers this week on Patrick Mahomes. All right, we've got a couple questions in the chat. So, yeah, you can throw your questions in the chat. I will stay on until they're all gone. So, there we go. George Cook from YouTube, pick 2, half PPR, Mike Evans, Darius Slayton, Jamal Williams. Oh, this is gross. This is gross. I think you're still going with Mike Evans and Jamal Williams this week. Evans has been disappointing as of late, but it's mostly been due to him falling on the wrong side of variance. He's been missed down the field on a couple throws that would have been touchdowns. He's dropped a couple touchdowns over the last few games, and Jamal Williams is a touchdown machine, right? And I think that this is going to be a much better matchup. The Vikings were one of the most difficult run defenses against running backs, whereas, the Jets are a little bit more gracious. So I would go Mike Evans and Jamal Williams there. I'm not a big fan of Darius Slayton for what it's worth. Connor LaRose from YouTube, 1 running back, 1 flex, 1 wide receiver. Okay, so Swift, ETN, Higgins, DPJ, Gabe Davis, Elijah Moore, Rashad White, full PPR, and I have to pick a defense too. Man, Connor, this is some heavy lifting here. Well, let's talk through some of the running backs. Swift, ETN, and Rashad White. If I'm picking one for right now, it's Travis Etienne. He's the one with the most guaranteed workload. Because Rashad White is still splitting 50-50, and same thing with DeAndre Swift. So give me ETN even in a tough matchup against Dallas. I think that ETN has the best chance to fall into the end zone given the volume of carries. And then the question between flex and wide receiver, Higgins, DPJ, Gabe Davis, Elijah Moore. If T. Higgins is healthy, you are firing him up. We're going to monitor the injury report for T. Higgins. I haven't heard anything yet. I'll have to check it out later. But ultimately, we're listening to whether the Bengals have been limiting T. Higgins or if he is going to be good to go for this weekend. Whereas I think you're flexing Donovan Peoples-Jones unless you want to go with Rashad White. And this is full PPR. So why don't we go with Rashad White in full PPR? If this was half PPR and you wanted the yardage, I think I would have gone with DPJ, but you just can't trust Gabe Davis right now. He's just been so terrible as of late. And if we're looking at team defenses, I'll pull up my rankings here in just a second. Baltimore, Vikings, Packers in the defenses. And let's see, the Vikings I have at 14. The Packers, I'm scanning and I don't see where they are. Oh, they're second. Green Bay Packers are second. That's why I didn't scroll up for far enough. And then Baltimore is my 17th. So in order, I would go Packers and then Vikings and then the Baltimore Ravens there, Connor. All right, let's talk about, speaking of Baltimore, running back J.K. Dobbins. J.K. Dobbins, look, we saw what we wanted to see from J.K. Dobbins in week 14 in his return from the knee injury. He led the Ravens in rushes. He carried the ball 15 times. He ran for 120 yards. He scored a touchdown. He had nice burst on his breakaway run. And the Ravens faced the Cleveland Browns this week on Saturday. The Browns allow the third most fantasy points to running backs and are Football Outsiders' third most favorable rush DVOA matchup. And with Tyler Huntley expected to return, fantasy managers should have more confidence in Baltimore's offense getting into scoring range. Dobbins will be no worse than my running back 12 on the week. He is consensus running back 22. If you're here for a spicy take, let me give one to you. And that is Alvin Kamara. He's just struggled this ever since week 9. He's finished no better than running back 19 during that span. But in fact, over the last 2 weeks, Alvin Kamara has finished as the running back 51 and 45 with 87 total scrimmage yards on 27 touches, right? Barely 3 yards a touch. It's been ugly for Alvin Kamara. And while Atlanta may be a tempting matchup, the optimism seems unfounded. In week 1 against the Falcons, Alvin Kamara finishes the running back 47. He had 46 total yards. He had 12 touches. And PFF projects the Atlanta Falcons defensive line to have a 44% run block advantage over the New Orleans Saints offensive line, limiting the rushing upside of Kamara. And Kamara is outside my top 24 of running backs this week. He's the consensus running back 10. I just don't understand the optimism. And Elijah Moore. I think I'm going to have to move down Elijah Moore after the Mike White benching. But Moore, he was a perfect cheap stack piece. And there still is a little bit of optimism for Elijah Moore because the Lions give up the most fantasy points to quarterbacks and the third most fantasy points to wide receivers. At least we can hang our hat on Moore eclipsing 80% snap share for the first time since he was benched back in the middle of the season. Corey Davis was just ruled out. And Elijah Moore, he played ahead of Denzel Mims. Moore earned 10 targets in week 14. He caught 6 passes. He earned his fourth red zone target over the last 2 games. And I still think Elijah Moore is a flex option, but more boom bust than a safer flex option if Mike White was starting. So just because Zach Wilson is one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL right now, at least among starting quarterbacks. So I would not have, the ceiling is cut off for Elijah Moore, but hopefully he can prove us wrong. It's just, I don't see a lot of optimism for Elijah Moore this week with Zach Wilson behind center. Lower ranked wide receiver for the week is Mike Evans. The last 5 weeks, they've not been too kind to Mike Evans. He's finished as the wide receiver 34 or worse each of those weeks, and he's finished as wide receiver 44 or worse in 4 of those games. He's fallen on the wrong side of variance. I mentioned earlier about Evans that Brady's missed him on deep passes, and Evans has egregiously dropped other passes. And even though Evans has commanded a large enough target share, he's had 22 targets over the last 3 games, 2 of those games, 9 targets each, he only has 10 receptions to show for it. Brady may lead the league in pass attempts, but his yards per attempt is 22nd among quarterbacks. And Brady, he's turning Chris Godwin into Deontay Johnson and Mike Evans into George Pickens. That's ugly. The matchup doesn't help this week as the Cincinnati Bengals allow the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And Mike Evans is my wide receiver 30 this week. He's the consensus wide receiver 23. A higher ranked tight end for this week, David Njoku. The calculus is simple for Njoku. He's the tight end 6 in fantasy points per game on the season. He commands nearly a 25% target rate when he's on the field. He's tight end 7 in yards per route run and yards per target. He's tight end 6 in yards per team pass attempt. So clearly he's in about that top 6 tier. But this week, Amari Cooper is expected to be limited due to his hip injury. And it's clearly limited Cooper, as he's finished as the wide receiver 55 or worse each of the past 2 weeks. And the last time David Njoku played Baltimore, Njoku finished at the 10-5. He went 7 for 71, 7 targets. He didn't fall in the end zone, but if he did, he would be a top 3 option. And I think that changes this week. I think Njoku has a big game, gets a touchdown, and he's my tight end 2 on the week. And you're saying, but wait, didn't George Kittle just have a big? Yeah, George Kittle had a 2 touchdown game, and I moved George Kittle up from tight end 5 to tight end 3 on the week. So I'll take that as a win. My last player I want to talk about today is lower ranked tight end Evan Ingram. What goes up must come down, and that's the case for Evan Ingram. While he may have propelled so many best ball drafters into the playoffs, his matchup in Week 15 is much less favorable. The Dallas Cowboys give up the fewest fantasy points to tight ends, and Ingram's tight end linebacker matchup projects as a negative 22% advantage, and that's in Dallas's favor. And we've seen scary floors for Evan Ingram. He's finished as the tight end 50, 35, 39, and tight end 50 again in 4 different weeks. And there have been a variety of reasons. It could be matchup, it could be game script, it could be that he's gotten hurt. But whatever the reason, Evan Ingram is still just a boom bust tight end 2. He's not the confident back end tight end 1 he's projected as, nor is he the tight end 4 like how he ranks in fantasy points in half PPR. He's my tight end 15 this week. You should not be depending upon Evan Ingram. If you are, best of luck to you. I hope that I hope you win, but that I just don't think is a good bet for this week. All right, everyone. Make sure you're following me on Twitter at FFStalder. My name is Bradley. Make sure you're getting that fantasy data subscription. Okay, use the promo code FFF20 for 20% off any sized fantasy data subscription. And until next time, everyone, good luck with your Week 15 matchups, and don't forget about the Saturday games. Have a good one, everyone.